not a nation that was prepared for a life of service and glorification to God. They had to be prepared. Now, last week I made this preparation, but we had a little problems with the sound last week. Maybe you might not have heard the comparison. But imagine, if you will, you're riding on a bus in the middle of the night, and it pulls up to some strange place that you've never been to before. They hustle you off the bus onto a set of yellow footprints. You're about to begin a transformation from one world to another. And this is what you hear.
Coming out, boy! We're going through Depot, Pass Island, South Carolina, and you're just taking a bus stop. Going to come left on the Wall Street Spike Board, the United States Marine Corps. You've been set at position attention. That means your ears are touching, feet at a 45-degree angle, and your mouth shut. I say again, your mouth is shut.
Those first few moments were meant to disorient you, to introduce you to a new way of life. You're about to take a step from being civilian to being a United States Marine. They described it as being a culture shock. They come at you with all of this, all these instructions yelling back and forth and hustling you, and rapid fire commands that you were expected to obey immediately, and it's a culture shock. And that's what it was meant to be, a culture shock, knowing that you are about to be prepared for a new level of service. When you leave there after some 16 weeks, you will not be a civilian, but you will be a United States Marine. Preparation. Now, by the same token, when Israel left Egypt after 400 years of slavery, they functioned, or rather misfunctioned, as a mob. God had to prepare them for life as a free nation. They didn't just leave Egypt knowing how to be a nation. They were all this misguided mob that were all full of questions about where they're going to go and what they're going to do. So God had to teach them. He had to teach them how to follow him and his anointed and appointed leaders. This was, in fact, the trek across the wilderness was, in fact, basic training. It was the boot camp for the nation of Israel to be prepared to be a nation. They had to be taught morals, ethics, values, not just any morals, but godly morals, godly ethics, godly values. The Israelites needed to be transformed from a band of slaves into a functional society that would reflect God's character. This would be a journey of transformation, and there would be many tests along the way. And like I said, this quarter will tell the story of that transformation. Our unit titles were right now in the second lesson of our first unit, which talks about God's provisions. You know, when you first enter into basic training, one of the things they need to do is provide you provisions. They feed you a meal. They give you a place to stay. And then they start the process of transforming you into a soldier or a sailor or a Marine. So God knew that the first concern that the new nation would have would be provisions. Where will we get food? Where will we get water? We see in these first four lessons how God provided for the Israelites. And then next month in October, we'll start with instructions. God will now start to instruct them, will start to teach them about what they should do and how they should act in order to glorify God through their lives. And then, of course, there were many tests along the way, and some of those tests that the people of Israel failed, so they had to be corrected. That is the unit of study for the month of November. So provisions, instructions, correction. All three important elements to the preparation of a nation. Well, here's a brain teaser for you. You might see a bunch of random letters here, but actually it means something when you think about it. Now, the question here is, what liquid is this? Studying the letters there, anybody remember what kind of liquid this is? Let me give you a hint. It's one of the most important liquids that's vital to survival. It's water. And how do you figure it out? Because it's H2O. That's what it is. It's water. Now, let's talk about the wonders of water. Water is an incredible resource. It's an incredible substance. It was in the earth even before the beginning of time, and it is still here on the earth today. Some things about water you may not recognize or know. It's inorganic. We all know that. It's colorless. It's odorless. It's tasteless. It might seem like, well, if it's colorless, odorless, and tasteless, then it must not be good for anything. But yet, water is vital to all life on earth. We cannot survive without water. It's amazing what that odorless, colorless, tasteless substance can do and how vital it is. Now, like I said, some interesting facts about water. I call it the wonders of water. It says here about 6,800 gallons of water is required to grow a day's food for a family of 4. Can you imagine that? 6,800 gallons. And with as many families as there are on the earth, that adds up to millions of, I dare say billions of gallons of water. Something you might not know about water is that 70% of the human brain is water. Talk about water on the brain? Well, 70% of your brain is water. And a person can live for a month without food, but can only live a week without water. That shows you just how vital it is. Water regulates the Earth's temperature, which determines the different climates. We have tropical climates here, high humidity, lots of water in the air. We have desert climates with not enough humidity, not enough water in the air. It controls the climate of the Earth. It's amazing. And water can dissolve more substances than any other liquid on Earth, including sulfuric acid. It's amazing what water can do. If you've seen the Grand Canyon, you'll know that it is a vast canyon with all kinds of rock formations carved into the earth by the slow-running Colorado River at the base of the canyon. It took billions of years, but eventually water did all of that work. It's an amazing substance. Oh, and one other thing. It takes 20 gallons of water to brew 1 pint of beer. Something to think about when you reach for a cold one next time. Amen? Now, some points to consider as we look at water. See, when God sent the 10 plagues to get the attention of Pharaoh and the Egyptians to get them to let the people go, one of the most important was turning all of the waters in Egypt, including the Nile River, to blood. See, people in Egypt relied upon the Nile River. They even had a god of the river. That shows you just how important they valued their water. So God knew where to hit them. He hit them where it hurts, turning the Nile River into blood. And so even after witnessing that miracle and all the other miracles and seeing how God brought them out of Egypt and split the waters of the Red Sea so they can pass through on dry land, God demonstrated his power and ability in all these situations. And yet, the children of Israel were worried about finding water in the wilderness. They never really took time to think and consider, well, God turned water into blood. So why are we worried about water? I'm pretty sure God has a plan. But of course, when you're stuck in a tough situation, your focus is on the situation and not on the God who controls your situation. You know, one of the names of God we always talk about is Jehovah Jireh, the Lord our provider. Sometimes we need to be reminded that God has everything and can provide anything and everything that we need. And so our lesson today, God provides water from a rock. We're looking at Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. Again, looking at God's provision for the newly freed nation of Israel, his way of showing that he is in control. He was the one that led them out of Egypt. He was the one that split the Red Sea and caused them to cross over on dry land. He was the one that last week provided quail in the evening and manna from heaven in the morning for the people to eat. And so with all of these miracles, with all of these examples of God's power and God's provision, and the children of Israel still murmured and complained. Let me read something from the introduction here that's very profound here when we look at our own lives. It says, life is full with tests. Tests. When we are infants, our parents release our grip on our hands to see if we can walk on our own. Our school years are filled with tests. And later there are other kinds of tests. Driver's tests, fitness tests, college entrance tests, employment tests, and innumerable medical tests. They are all designed to benefit us in some way. That's incredible. Tests can be so stressful, and yet they are designed to benefit us in a certain way. And since the same is true of spiritual tests, they often accompany physical tests, challenging us to trust the Lord through pain, suffering, loss, and hardship. Even when we can see no immediate benefits, such tests are beneficial to us in the long run. Has anybody in this room or anybody watching on Facebook or Zoom, has anybody not been through a test? Nobody should be raising their hand because all of us have been through one test or another at some point in our lives. But if you haven't, all you have to do is keep living, and chances are you will encounter a test. And the test is meant for you to strengthen your faith. That's what the Bible says. The Bible says, count it all joy when you fall into various tests and trials, because the trying of your faith worketh patience. That's the benefit. It works your faith. I mean, what good does it have to have faith if you don't put it into use, if you don't put it to exercise, if you don't exercise your faith? If you don't exercise your muscles every day, those muscles are going to atrophy and grow weak, and they won't do their job. You have to put your muscles under some kind of exertion every day in order to make them stronger. And by the same token, your faith has to be put under a certain type of exertion every day, in little things and in big things. And we have to trust that God has put these tests into our lives for a purpose, to make us better. So here's a test: God providing water from a rock. When we look at this lesson and we see the reaction of the Israelites, we need to look in that mirror and see if we can see ourselves in the Israelites when we are faced with a situation. Once again, Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. That is the one thing that we need to take from this lesson. The one lesson that the Israelites had not learned yet. And you would think that after they saw God rain 10 plagues down on their enemies to get Pharaoh's iron heart to crack, and so he finally had to call Moses in the middle of the night, not waiting until the end of the plague, not waiting until the morning. He called Moses in the middle of the night, saying, okay, I give, take your people and go. And then bringing them out and across the wilderness. And then, boom, a roadblock. The Red Sea in front of them. And they turned behind, and Pharaoh's army is coming up behind them. Pharaoh had to change their heart. And they started to complain. The first test of the Israelites was at the Red Sea. And they failed. What did they tell Moses? Did you bring us out here from Egypt to die in the wilderness? I think you'll find that is a very common theme of all the grumblings of the children of Israel against God. They say the same thing. But what was Moses' response? Moses turned to God. God said, stretch forth your staff across the Red Sea. It says, stand still and see the salvation of God. The Red Sea parted, and they were able to cross over on dry land, not a muddy seabed, not a pit of miry clay, but dry, bone-dry land, with walls of water on this side and walls of water on that side, and they were able to cross through. And so, when they got to the other side and the Egyptians were rushing in, then God told Moses, stretch your staff out again. And the waters closed up over the entire Egyptian army. We're talking, I dare say, thousands, if not tens of thousands, of soldiers and horses and chariots, fully armed and ready for battle, but now they were all swept away by the mighty Red Sea. Now you would think that the people will have learned that the Lord will provide them. But then they go across the wilderness, And we look in our lesson last week, they stop in a place, and what do? They start complaining to Moses again. We don't have no food to eat. Did you bring us from Egypt to die in the wilderness? It's like a record with a stuck needle. The same complaint over and over again. What did God tell Moses? You tell the people that when you wake up in the morning, you will find bread from heaven. And you gather what you need for that particular day. And in the evening, I will send quail for you to eat. Now, when you gather the manna in the morning, this is important. This was another test. When you gather the manna in the morning, only gather what you need for that day. The only time when you will gather more than one day is when you gather it out on the sixth day, the day preceding the Sabbath, because no work will be done on the Sabbath. So what did the people do? They went out and they started gathering more than they needed for one day, and it wasn't the sixth day. And what did God do? Say, well, you failed that test. I'm going to smite that manna that you're setting aside just in case. Have any of us ever had a contingency plan? We prayed to God for something. We prayed to God for something, for a change in our situation. Said, well, I know that God will answer my prayer, but I'm just going to go over here and do this just in case. Anybody had a just-in-case scenario? I mean, that's what the people had, the Israel had. They had a mindset. I know God said to only gather what we need for one day, but I'm just going to gather just this little extra and set it aside just in case. But imagine them waking up in the morning, and they're looking over and say, okay, I'm not sure if there's manna out there, but it's a good thing I've got this extra stash. But then they come around and, whoa, what is that smell? God had smitten that extra manna that they had gathered and caused worms to crawl over. And it was good for nothing. And God standing up there going, what did I tell you to do? It's like so many times when we were growing up and they tell us not to do something. They tell us not to do something. They tell us to do something. And then we don't do it. And then they come up and say, what did I tell you? God had to constantly tell the Israelites, what did I tell you? Only gather what you needed for one day. They failed the test. And so they continue this journey, and now we come to another test. Another test of the Israelites' faith. Again, this was basic training. They had to learn how to do things God's way. When you enter into the military, you cannot do things your way anymore. You cannot do things your way. You cannot do things Selena Crowder's way. You can't do things Terry Carter's way. You can't do things Ruby Dixon's way. You can't do things John Williams' way. You've got to learn how to do it the Army way, or the Navy way, or the Air Force way, or the Marines way. They have to teach you how to do it. In this basic training trek from Egypt to the Promised Land, the Israelites had to break the habit of doing things their way, or in this case the Egyptians' way, and had to learn how to do things God's way. And so we look at how the Lord will provide. And in every situation, we have to remember that our focus should be on God. God is our source. God is our provider. Psalm 95:6 is our main thought. It says, oh, come, let us worship and bow down. That should be our reaction when we're facing problems. When times are good, oh, come, let us worship and bow down. When times are bad, oh, come, let us worship and bow down. When we got money in the bank, oh, come, let us worship and bow down. When the money is funny and the credit won't get it, oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Where our wallet is empty and our stomach is equally empty, we look in the refrigerator and we just see a jar of water, oh, come, let us worship and bow down. We have to submit to the fact that we and ourselves cannot provide for ourselves. But God himself is our provider, and God alone is our provider. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker. Because he made us, he knows what we need before we even ask him, but he wants us to ask so that we can depend fully on him. Depend fully on him. Let's look at our lesson aims for today. To see the facts of God's miracle at Rephidim. To understand that God is powerful and has the ability to solve all our problems. Again, that was a lesson that God was trying to teach the nation of Israel even when they were coming out of Egypt. They saw how God delivered them and caused them to come out of captivity. They saw how God parted the Red Sea and caused them to cross over on the dry land. But test after test after test, and they still failed to understand the power of God. They complain, they whine against God. Oh, their complaints were directed to Moses, but they didn't seem to realize that they were really complaining to God. It's like when your parents do something, or I dare say, let me just make it generic. When a spoiled, rotten child, which had everything handed to them on a silver platter by their parents, and yet it's still not satisfied. They whine, oh, my parents don't love me, they don't do this, they don't do that. Look at what all they've done for you, you spoiled brat. That's what the Israelites were acting like. They were acting like spoiled brats. God had provided everything for them, and yet they still complained when they were faced with a problem, instead of turning to the one who had delivered them in the past. Sometimes we develop selective amnesia when we're faced with a problem. Anyone ever developed selective amnesia? You're faced with a new problem, and God has brought you through problems in the past, some of them worse than the ones you're facing now, but the moment we face a new problem, it's like all over again. The Israelites all over again. Oh, I don't know how I'm going to get out of this situation. And hello, God has brought you out of worse situations before. So I think the question is, and I want to pose it to the people in here, is why, as Christians, why do we always turn to doubt and fear over every situation, knowing that God brought us out of worse situations in the past? How do we explain that, Reverend Williams? Our carnal nature. All right, Sister Crowder, anything to add? Okay, so in the flesh, we don't depend on God. Our fleshly nature is always warring with our spiritual nature. Hey, Sister Carter, anything to add to that? Yeah, we go to everybody else for help before we go to God. But it says, when I was looking at my lesson, it said prayer should be our first resort. But it's always our last resort. When we've tried everything else, then we say, okay, now I'll pray. Okay, Sister Ruby, anything you want to add to that? Mm-hmm. Okay, so doubt overriding fear, and that shouldn't be the case because we must walk by faith and not by sight, not by what we see, but by what we know. So that is the main problem why we sometimes can't understand or turn to God in every situation instead of turning to our own understanding and complaining and fretting about everything. There's no reason for it when we know that God has done it. The Israelites saw God's mighty hand moving when they were still in Egypt. Saw them move when he came out of Egypt, when they came across the Red Sea, when he gave them manna, when he gave them quail. And now yet still, they don't understand that situation, that concept that God is powerful and has the ability to solve all our problems. And so the final aim is to look for the hand of God in all our situations. So the next time we find ourselves facing a problem or facing a situation, do we need to shift our pattern of thinking, to shift our view, and to look at this as, God is bringing this test into my life to see whether I will trust him or not. We need to think about that. All of these tests that are happening are to test our faith. But so many times we're focusing on the hopelessness of the situation in our view, That we don't pause and think about, well, what does God want me to do in this situation? He would want me to trust him. He would want me to turn to him, to exercise my faith. So we need to look for the hand of God in all our situations. And when we find, or when we look and actively look for the hand of God in all of our situations, then we can see that there's nothing to worry about, because as long as God is there, he's got it under control. And our lesson outline, we're going to look at the test. That's verses 1 through 3. The responses to the test, verses 4 to 6. And then the rebuke, which tells us what? The Israelites were tested. They responded to the test. And the rebuke tells them that they what? Failed the test yet again. And sometimes we have to, like I said, bang our head against a brick wall until finally we come to the realization, hey, wait a minute. What am I doing? I'm doing the same thing, but expecting a different result every time. What do we call that? Insanity. Doing the same thing, but expecting a different result. And one of these days, we're going to have to come to the realization, hey, if we want a different result, we have to start acting differently. We have to start thinking differently. Instead of complaining, we need to start praising our way through. Instead of turning to man, instead of turning to that bottle, instead of turning to that $200 an hour psychiatrist, we need to turn to God and pray and let him handle it. So let's take a look at the test. First, we're going to talk about the Lord testing the people. Like I said, the Lord will bring tests along the way. There are many tests that you encounter in basic training to test your physical strength, to test your mental acuity, to test your problem-solving skills. And how you handle those tests will determine whether or not you pass or fail. So here comes a test, yet another test. Because again, I said that God had tested the people before at the Red Sea, and they failed the test. They were in the wilderness and they started complaining about food and water, and they failed the test. And yet still God provided for them. He used all of these as teaching moments. You've got to learn from your mistakes. But we're going to see if the children of Israel learned from their previous mistakes. Let me go ahead and get right into the lesson. Looking at verse 1 says, "And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys, according to the commandment of the Lord." That's very important, that phrase, according to the commandment of the Lord. It says here, it was not the people's choice, nor Moses' choice, to camp in Rephidim. Rather, God had specifically directed them to this place where there was no water. And why would he do this? We already know the answer: to test his people. So it had already been only a few weeks since they had faced a similar situation. Back in chapter 15, they camped out in a place where the waters were bitter, and they couldn't drink of them. And the people, what? Complained to Moses. And what did they say? You should know this by now. Did you bring us from Egypt to die in the wilderness, in the wilderness, in the wilderness, in the wilderness? Sorry, got stuck in my head there for a moment. And so Moses, notice how Moses reacted when they came to complain to him. Did he turn around and say, why don't you stop complaining about it? Why don't you stop your belly aching and blah, 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 blah? No. It says here, he turned and prayed to God. While the Israelites reacted the wrong way to their situation, and Moses reacted the right way, because their murmuring to him was Moses' test of his leadership. And he responded the right way. He passed his test. He turned to God. And he said, prayed to God, said, what do I do? Well, God said, take a tree, throw it into the river, and the waters will become sweet, and they'll be able to drink. And they had an abundance. They were able to quench their thirst. So now, that was another test. And scrawl a big fat red F on that paper, because yet they failed that test. Now, a few weeks later, here they are at this place called Rephidim, where it says there was no water. It says here, It says, after their journeys, according to the command of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Now you would think that once they pitched there, and they started looking around for water, do you see any water? Do you see any streams? Do you see any rivers? I don't see any water. I don't see any water. Now here is a moment where they could have said, well, wait a minute. We shouldn't worry because remember just 2 weeks ago, we were at that place with bitter waters and God made those waters sweet? So if he could do that, then what makes you think that he can't find us water here? Why don't we go to God and ask him? That's what they should have done. But what did they do instead? Verse 2. Wherefore the people did chide with Moses. It says here, the answer was not long in coming. God was testing them again. Would they trust the Lord to provide for them as he had before? Will they recall in their minds? It seems like one constant command of the children of Israel from God is to remember. Remember this. Remember that. When you cross the river Jordan, take 12 stones and put them in the riverbed to remember. Remember how God did this, how God did that. But yet they didn't remember. Said, would they trust the Lord to provide for them as they had before? Or would they once again grumble and complain? Had they learned their lesson? Or would they continue their already established pattern? This was a very real test of their faith. And what happened? The answer was not long in coming. The people began to chide with Moses. The verb chide means to strive or contend. It is employed for verbal combat and sometimes used of a legal dispute. It could mean that the people were not merely complaining against Moses, but also arguing that they did not deserve what they were suffering. So what did they say? It says here, wherefore the people did chide with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. You notice they were asking, who were they asking here? They were asking Moses, give us water to drink. You brought us to this place, Moses. Give us water to drink. It says here they should have humbly asked him to pray and ask God for water. It says here they could not seem to look beyond their leader to the God who had made them their leader. It's like I always say, they focused on their situation, but not on the God who controlled their situation. So they went to Moses and they said, where's the water at? Why don't you give us water? You brought us out here, now where's the water at? And once again, Moses was facing a test too. Here they come with those same old complaints. But what did Moses do? Moses said, why chide ye with me? Wherefore do ye tempt the Lord? Moses had to tell them the same thing he told them in last week's lesson. I mean, I can imagine Moses standing there listening to the complaints of the people, and then he simply said, did you not listen to a word I said before? You are not complaining against me, but you are complaining against God, you spoiled brats.
That's right. Come on. Yes.
And you're treading on very thin ice. Very thin ice. And you would think, again, I'm going to use that last time, you would think that would give the children of Israel pause and saying, oh yeah, that's right. I remember we said that we don't want to be testing God. We don't want to be tempting God. But no, they were still focused on their situation, not on the God who controlled their situation. Verse 3 says, and the people thirsted there for water. And the people murmured against Moses again and said, wherefore is this thou hast brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? Here comes that broken record again. Did you bring us from Egypt to die in the woods? Oh, sorry. Got stuck in the brain again. When you say something long enough, it gets stuck in your brain. And too many times we let the wrong thoughts get stuck in our brain. Because we keep thinking the wrong thoughts. We keep focusing on the wrong things, and it gets stuck in our brain like a broken record. And what we need to do is we need to erase that and put some positive thoughts in there. God is my provider. God is my healer. God is my deliverer. God is my savior. God is, God is, God is, God is, God is. That's the one thing you need to be having on a repeat in your head. God is, God is, God is, God is. That's what you need to have playing on repeat. So again, Moses facing a test. What is the test? People are complaining against him. God had told Moses, they're not complaining against you, but they're complaining against me. What do? You come to me. Don't go out and try to contend with those people, because you can't win. But come to me. So, the children of Israel, did they pass their test? Did they pass their test? Big fat F. But here's Moses. In verse 4 he says, and Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, what shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me. Moses' response was to ask the people why they were contending with him and tempting the Lord. It says any complaints against Moses were actually complaints against the Lord, because he was the one who had brought them to this place. If Moses was guilty of anything, it was obeying the Lord. So we see the Lord testing the people. And then the people responded by tempting the Lord. They failed the test. But now let's look at the responses. The response of Moses. Verse 4 says, Lord, Moses cried unto the Lord. It says Moses responded properly by appealing to the Lord. Why? Because he had his focus in the right place. He said the Lord was the one who had led them to this place and who had promised to take them to the promised land. He was also the one the nation should have turned to for deliverance, rather than turn on Moses in their search for someone to blame. We always want to search for somebody to blame in a situation. The blame game. But instead of playing the blame game, why don't we play the trust game? Instead of blaming everybody else but ourselves, notice how we always look at to blame everybody else. It's your fault. It's her fault. It's his fault. It's Trump's fault. It's Sheila Jackson Lee's fault. It's Sylvester Turner's fault. No. They never look at themselves. They never look at themselves. They never blame themselves. So instead of playing the blame game, why don't you play the trust game and turn to God? So Moses passed his test. His response was to plead to God. What shall I do unto this people? Unto is best understood here as meaning with respect to these people. What shall I do about this people's constant complaining? It's getting on my nerves. I tell you, y'all about to make me lose my mind up in here, up in here. That's what he could have said, but he didn't. But he told God that. They're about to make me lose my mind up in here. It says Moses was utterly frustrated with the people. He was a patient man, but he did not have the patience the Lord possessed. Again, his patience had to be worked out, had to be put under stress so it can be stronger. He did not know what he should do, and it appeared the people were ready to stone him to death. In fact, he was doing exactly what he should do with regard to the people. He was taking their needs and his own to the Lord. Now, look at our situation. It says here, as Christians, we acknowledge the power of prayer, but too often pray as a last resort rather than a continual practice. When we find ourselves faced with a situation we don't know what to do, what do? We go to the loan shark to take out a 150% interest compounded hourly loan with your arm and your leg literally as collateral to try to pay off some debt that will only be just a fraction of what you owe. And we'll do all of that. And yet, when all that doesn't work, then we'll pray to God. But then when we pray to God, And he solves our problem right then and there, and we realize, man, why did I do that? I mean, have you ever been in a situation where you call yourself solving it on your own, and you make the situation worse? And then God stepped right in after you prayed to him, and God stepped in and solved it just like that, and you realize, you didn't need to do all of that. And you look back, hindsight 2020, why did I do that? What do we need to do when we're faced with a situation? Pray to God first and not last. Since for some reason we think we can provide for our own needs and for those who depend on us. But we should never lose sight of the simple truth that we are dependent on the Lord for our daily bread. That's how we pray. Give us this day our daily bread. We are submitting that we cannot provide for ourselves day by day, even minute by minute, even second by second. Has any one of us developed the ability to breathe on our own? No. It's God that gives us that breath and that breath and that breath. And we know that if God were to take away the breath right now, every one of us would be falling down dead. We depend on God for our breath every millisecond. We are dependent on God for something. A lot of people say, I can handle things on my own. I mean, I keep going back to what Timothy McVeigh said before he was executed. He quoted the poem, I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. You ain't master of nothing. Because you depend on God, whether you want to believe it or not. Because God provides you the breath, the same breath that you use to spew out things against God. I don't believe in God, or blah, 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 or this, that, and the other. When God gave you that very breath. We've got to wake up and realize that God provides for us every single second of every single day. It is to him we should turn for strength, help, and the wisdom we need to meet every challenge we face in life. So, the people of Israel were tested. They failed. They came up against Moses. Moses was tested. He passed his test. He was showing the people of Israel what they need to do when faced with a situation. And he showed it time and time again. At the Red Sea, they grumbled against Moses. Moses went to God. They were delivered. In the middle of the wilderness, when they didn't have any food, the people complained to Moses. Moses went to God. They were fed. When they looked and they saw the bitter waters, they complained to Moses. Moses went to God. Are you seeing a pattern here? Moses is leading by example. He's saying, all right, looks like I'm about to show these stupid people again what to do when you're faced with a situation. I'm not going to lash out at them. I'm going to go to God, and hopefully they're going to get it this time that they need to pray to God. Now, of course, Moses wasn't perfect in how he handled every situation, but he was consistent. He consistently went to God. And because he consistently went to God, God always had an answer. Here was God's response. Verse 5. And the Lord said unto Moses, go on before the people, and take with thee the elders of Israel, and thy rod, wherewith thou smotest the river. Take in thine hand, and go. So what did he tell Moses to do? Take that staff. Remember, Moses had received this, had a shepherd's staff in his hand when he was called from the burning bush. God made sure that he used that staff as a conductor of his power. What did he tell Moses to do? Throw your staff down. It became a serpent. Take the serpent by the tail. It became a staff. When he went into Egypt and told Pharaoh, let my people go, Pharaoh said, are you kidding me? What did God tell him? Take your staff and smite the waters. Yeah. They turned to blood. Take your staff and smite the air. Locusts came. Take your staff and smite the cattle. Carrion and disease. And then, when they were left out of Egypt and they were trapped at the Red Sea, the people complained to Moses again. What did he tell Moses to do? Take your staff and stretch it out over the sea. Now, make no mistake about it, there was no power in that staff. It was God's power flowing through that staff. and the faith and obedience of Moses that was the catalyst for all of these things to happen. And so Moses thinking to himself, okay, I've got the staff. It's like my American Express card. I never leave home without it. It says, so take your staff, take the elders of Israel, and go before the people. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb, and thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, that the people may drink. So that was God's response. Take your staff, take the elders, go before the people to the rock in Horeb. Stand before the rock and smite the rock. Hit that rock twice. And water will flow out of the rock, and everybody will be able to slake their thirst. Now notice how Moses responded in every situation. I think he learned his lesson when he was called at the burning bush. He had questions for God. Who am I that I should go and send the Israelites? I'm slow of speech. Perhaps should I say I don't believe me? And God had to get mad with him for finally considering Moses, for finally convincing Moses to go. So I think Moses learned his lesson not to question God, just to do what he says.
Yeah.
He developed that Nike attitude. What does Nike always say? Just do it. When God told Moses to take your staff and smite the river so it might turn to blood, he just did it. He didn't ask God. When God told Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea that the waters may part, he just did it. He didn't question God. And so now God is telling Moses to take your staff and go out before the rock and smite the rock 2 times and water will gush forth. And did Moses question God? He just did it. That's what he said. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. It says here, the tests we face in life not only teach us lessons, they also reveal our character. The true character of the Israelites came out when they faced great difficulties. They had not learned from previous experiences to look to the Lord to provide. But on the other side of the coin, Moses had learned from his experiences. He learned from his call from the burning bush that you don't want to question God. You just want to do what he says. And he learned from test after test after test, you always come to me. Some battles just aren't worth fighting. Let me fight those battles. Bring your problems to me, and I'll take care of the rest. So, it says here, Moses responded properly by appealing to the Lord, and as always, the Lord was waiting with a solution to the problem. He instructed Moses to go out in front of the people, taking with them the elders of Israel, the staff the Nile River had been struck with. At a certain rock, the Lord would be standing in front of him. Moses was to strike the rock with his staff, and water would gush forth from it in such abundance that all the people would drink. And it says Moses did as the Lord instructed. He stood before that rock. I'm pretty sure in the back of his mind he was thinking, what if this doesn't work? What if this? What if that? What if... Got to beat those thoughts back. Just do it! He took the staff, smote the rock. The people were watching saying, what is this crazy leader of ours going to do now? He's standing in front of a rock. What does he expect to do? Does he expect water to come out of that rock? Oh, that's so funny. Water from a rock. Oh, did you hear what this guy said? Water from a rock. Water from a rock. Whoa, what the? And they see him strike the rock, and the water started gushing out. And people were amazed. They're like, whoa. And Moses saying, are you going to stand there, or are you going to have a drink? And so they drank with great abundance, and their thirst was quenched. The Lord graciously and miraculously provided the water his people needed. And at the same time, Moses rightfully gave them a lasting reminder of the sinful attitude they exhibited on this occasion. That was the rebuke. So God provided for what they needed. But now there was a lesson they had to learn. You know, when you fail at something, they usually give you a critique saying what you did wrong. You didn't do this, you should have done this. You didn't do this, you should have done this. You didn't do this, you should have done this. And so here's the critique. Here's the critique. This is what you did, Israel. This is why you failed this test. Let's look at the first part of verse 17. It says here, and he called the name of the place Massa and Meribah, because of the chiding of the children of Israel. It says here, Moses gave to that place the name Massa and Meribah. In Hebrew, Massa means tempting or testing. Meribah means strife or contention. So every time they would pass that place, oh, we're coming by Massa and Meribah. Don't you mention those names to me. I don't want to be reminded of my failure here. But they had to be. Every time they passed that place, they would have to be reminded, oh boy, I really should have trusted God there. Yeah, he did give us water, but boy, did he, what he had to do, what we said to him, and what he had to do to teach us what we failed to do, the failure of our faith, they had to be reminded of that. Again, remember. Remember and learn from your mistakes. So that's what he's saying. He called the name of the place Massa and Meribah because of the chiding of the children of Israel. And the second part, because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Now, did they say that audibly? Who knows? But they must have been thinking it. Is God even with us? Sometimes in our problems and in our trials and tribulations, we tend to say in our hearts, or maybe even say out loud, Lord, where are you? I don't see you. I thought you said you'd be with me, but I don't see you. That is dangerous, folks. That's a dangerous thought to get stuck in your head. It says here, this greatly added to their guilt. It was bad enough to complain about their circumstances, but they had also questioned God's presence among them. And think of his presence among them was obvious. The pillar of cloud was visible, and the manna arrived each morning from the hand of God. So I think even before that thought even entered out of their brain or out of their mouth, they knew it was wrong. They could see the presence of God. They knew that God was with them. But yet they weren't looking at God's presence. They were only looking at their situation. It says here, troubles should drive us to trust the one who has been so faithful to us through the years and praise him that he is sovereign and in control of all of our circumstances, good and bad. When we question God's presence, we are not focusing on the God who controls our situation and always has controlled our situations and always will control our situations. Again, here is another test, another cardinal test that would define the character of a nation of God's chosen people. And they failed that test. But the thing about God, and this is the kicker, even though they failed that test, God still brought them through to the promised land. Said, I am going to make sure that these lessons are going to be burned into you no matter what I have to do. God could have just shrugged his shoulders and thrown up his hand and said, well, that's it, I give up. You people are on your own. But he didn't do that. And is that how many times we face situation after situation, we lean to our own understanding instead of trusting God, forgetting about how he brought us through in the past? God could have said, that's it. That's it, Quita Pryor. You're on your own. Don't call on me anymore. No, but he doesn't. When we learned our lesson, when we made things worse with our solutions, and we come to God as a last resort, God is still there and is still gracious to help us out of our situation. But then it's incumbent upon us to learn from those situations, to trust God. Our practical points speak to that. It is possible to be in a difficult place and still be in the will of God. I mean, in our flawed thinking, in our finite understanding, we would say, if it was the will of God, he wouldn't have me in this situation. Hello? Why don't you flip the script? Maybe it's because of the situation that God is working his will through you. Again, our God is a radical God. He doesn't think like we think. My thoughts are not your thoughts. My thoughts are higher than your thoughts. Prayer should be a believer's first resort in adversity. Not last, but first. Obey God and trust him with your questions and fears. Prayer is critical to anyone who leads God's people. Because when we lead God's people, people are going to complain about the stuff, the way that we do things. Don't see Pastor Crowder knows all the complaints that come up against him that are spoken and unspoken about the way he runs this church? But notice he doesn't come right back at us saying, y'all going to make me lose my mind up in here. No. He goes to God. He goes to God in prayer. So any leader of God's people should learn not to contend with his people, but just to take it to God and let him handle it. Believers succeed by yielding all their resources and abilities to God. That's simply put, meaning that we know that he's God and we are not. We let him handle everything. Faith in God means that we trust him even when his plan does not make sense to us. Remember, Job tried to question God over why he was going through stuff like this. Sometimes it's not for us to understand or to question God, but just to trust him. And once Job stopped questioning God and started trusting God, God brought him out twice as much as what he had before. That's what happens when you trust God and not question him. Believers should express faith in prayer, not doubt in complaints to others. So, we take nothing else from this lesson. We need to take the lesson that if we obey in faith, we can rest in God's sovereign goodness and protection. And we can always say, just like the song says, sometimes the clouds hang low. I can hardly see the road. Sometimes I ask the question, Lord, why so much pain? But when I look around, I've had some good days. I've had some hills coming. I've had some weary days. I've had some sleepless nights. But when I look around and I think things over and I focus on what God has done, and I realize all my good days outweigh my bad days, and I won't complain. Because God has been good to me. More than this whole world could ever be. He's been good to me. Why? He dried all of my tears away. He turned my midnights into day. Even midnights that I caused myself by my own selfish actions and leaning to my own understanding. So instead of complaining, I'll just say, thank you, Lord. I know that you have a purpose in all of this. So, the journey of basic training continues. The preparation of a nation continues. And next Sunday, we're going to take a look at a roadblock on the way to the promised land. How do the Israelites handle the roadblock? And how should we handle any roadblocks on the way to our promised land? The preparation continues even today. Enter ye to learn. Go forth to serve. For his church, for his glory, for him alone. Why? Because God said so.